The passenger who never left. Truck driving can be lonely. Endless stretches of highway, the hum of the engine, and shadows creeping along the roadside. For Mitch, a seasoned long-haul trucker, loneliness had become his closest companion. But this trip was different. This trip would haunt him forever. It was a quiet night just past midnight, and Mitch was on a deserted two-lane highway cutting through an endless forest. His CB radio crackled faintly, but no one was out there. The nearest truck stop was over an hour away. His headlights pierced the darkness, but they couldn't push away the unease creeping into his chest. Then, up ahead, he saw her. A woman stood by the side of the road, illuminated in his high beams. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with tangled blonde hair and wearing a thin dress completely inappropriate for the cold. Her arm was outstretched, thumb pointing west. Mitch hesitated. He never picked up hitchhikers, company policy, and common sense. But something about her seemed desperate, vulnerable. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. The woman climbed into the cab without a word, shutting the door behind her. She smelled faintly of pine and something sour. "Thanks," she said softly, barely audible over the rumble of the truck. "Where are you headed?" Mitch asked, trying to keep it casual. "Just down the road," she replied. Her voice was distant, like she wasn't entirely present. He didn't press her. Something about her silence was unsettling, so he focused on the road. But the longer they drove, the stranger she seemed. She never shifted in her seat, never blinked when the overhead lights from passing signs illuminated her face. Her hands rested in her lap, pale and unmoving. After about 20 minutes, Mitch couldn't take the silence anymore. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, glancing at her. Her head slowly turned to him. "Do you believe in ghosts?" The question hit him like a jolt of static electricity. Can't say I do," Mitch replied, forcing a nervous laugh. "You should," she said, her voice flat. "They believe in you." Mitch felt a chill crawl down his spine. He gripped the wheel tighter, focusing on the road ahead. But then he noticed something in the rearview mirror. There was someone sitting in the sleeper cab behind him. Mitch's heart slammed against his ribs. He could only see the faintest outline, a shadowy figure hunched in the dark. "Who's back there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. She just smiled, a slow, eerie grin that didn't reach her eyes. Mitch swerved to the side of the road, slamming on the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop, and he twisted around to look into the sleeper cab. It was empty. His breath came in ragged gasps as he turned back to the woman. But she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, and the door was still locked. Mitch sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. Then he saw it, a smudge on the window, like the outline of a handprint, pressed against the inside of the glass. He wiped at it with his sleeve, but it wouldn't come off. Shaking, Mitch decided he'd had enough. He threw the truck into gear and drove on, vowing to never stop for anyone again. But the unease lingered, an oppressive weight in the cab. The rest of the trip was uneventful. No hitchhikers, no strange figures. By the time Mitch reached the truck stop, he convinced himself it had all been a trick of his tired mind. As he climbed out of the truck to grab a coffee, a fellow trucker parked nearby called out to him, "Hey, your back door's open." Mitch froze. He hadn't touched the trailer door since loading up at the depot hours ago. Heart pounding, he walked to the back of the truck. The heavy steel door was indeed ajar, swaying gently in the night breeze. With trembling hands, he pulled it open. Inside the trailer, he found her. The woman lying on the floor, her lifeless eyes staring up at him. Her body was cold, her dress soaked with blood. And on the wall, written in smeared crimson, were the words, "You should have kept driving." Mitch stumbled back, choking on his breath. But when he turned around, she was standing there, her head tilted unnaturally to one side, her pale hand reaching for him. The special sauce. There's a barbecue joint in a small, out-of-the-way town that's been there for decades. Locals call it the Smokehouse, though that's not its official name. The actual name, Lester's Barbecue, is barely visible on the faded, grease-stained sign hanging above the door. But the locals don't care about the name. They care about the food. People say it serves the best barbecue in the state, maybe even the country. The ribs practically melt off the bone. The brisket is so tender it's like butter, and the pulled pork has a smoky, tangy flavor that's unmatched. But what really sets the Smokehouse apart is its sauce. Thick, rich, with a mysterious depth of flavor. It's so good, it's almost addictive. Customers often leave with jars of it, swearing they've never tasted anything like it before. The owner, Lester Baines, is a quiet, older man. He's always in the back, tending the smokers and working on his secret recipes. He doesn't talk much, but he's friendly enough, always smiling faintly as he nods at customers from the kitchen doorway. Everyone respects him, even if there's something a little off about him. He never eats his own food, for one. People chalk it up to being around it all day, but it's still strange. One summer, a woman named Carrie moved to town. She was a food writer known for uncovering the secrets of small, hidden culinary gems, and the Smokehouse was on her radar. She made a reservation one Friday night and brought her notebook, camera, and an appetite. Carrie was blown away by the food. Every bite was a revelation. But as a journalist, her curiosity was piqued. She asked the waitress, a young woman named Jenny, about the sauce. Jenny just smiled nervously and said, "Oh, that's Lester's secret. Nobody knows the recipe, not even us." "Come on," Carrie teased. "You must have some idea. It's your signature dish." Jenny hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen. "I really don't know," she whispered. "Lester's particular about it. He makes it himself early in the morning before anyone else gets here. He doesn't let anyone watch." Carrie found this intriguing. She stayed late, finishing her meal and taking notes, until the other customers trickled out and the staff started cleaning up. She lingered, hoping for a chance to speak with Lester. When the restaurant finally emptied, she approached the counter. "Mr. Baines," she called. "Could I ask you about the sauce?" Lester stepped out from the shadows of the kitchen. He was an older man, with deeply lined features and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see straight through her. He didn't respond immediately, just stood there, wiping his hands on a stained towel. "It's just an old family recipe," he said finally. His voice was low and gravelly, like wood smoke. "Been in the family for generations. Any chance you'd share it with me? Or let me watch you make it?" Carrie asked, trying to sound charming. "It's incredible." Lester's smile tightened. "Sorry, miss. Some things are best left private." Carrie left, but she couldn't stop thinking about the sauce. The flavor was so unique, so complex, it felt like there was something more to it. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She decided to investigate. The next morning, Carrie arrived early before the restaurant opened. She parked down the street and waited, camera ready. At dawn, Lester's truck pulled up. She watched as he climbed out, carrying a large covered bucket toward the back entrance. She waited a few minutes, then crept closer. The back door was ajar, propped open for ventilation. Carrie crouched outside, peering in. She could see Lester moving around the kitchen, pouring something from the bucket into a massive pot. He stirred it slowly, methodically, humming to himself. She tried to get a better angle, accidentally knocking over a trash can. The noise echoed sharply, and Lester froze. He turned, his eyes locking onto hers through the crack in the door. Carrie's heart pounded. She bolted, not stopping until she was back in her car. She drove away, shaken, but also determined. She couldn't explain it, but there was something about the way he looked at her, like he knew something she didn't. Later that night, Carrie returned to the restaurant, this time under the cover of darkness. She broke into the dumpster area, searching for any clues. Among the usual garbage, she found something strange. A small, blood-stained piece of cloth. It looked like part of a shirt, with a faint logo she couldn't make out. Her stomach turned, but she took it, planning to investigate further. The next day, she visited the local library, digging through old newspaper archives. What she found made her blood run cold. Over the years, several people had gone missing in the area, drifters mostly, or people just passing through. None of them had ever been found. That night, Carrie couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the sauce, the missing people, and Lester's piercing gray eyes. Her gut told her there was a connection, but she needed proof. The next morning, Carrie returned to the smokehouse one last time. This time, she confronted Lester directly. She slammed the blood-stained cloth onto the counter and demanded an explanation. Lester didn't deny it. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. "You're a smart girl," he said finally. "Too smart for your own good." Before Carrie could react, Lester leaned in close and whispered something that chilled her to the bone. "It's not the sauce that's special, it's the smoke." Carrie fled, and the smokehouse was closed the next day. Lester disappeared without a trace, leaving behind an empty building and more questions than answers. No one knows what happened to him, or the people who went missing. But every so often, travelers passing through that small town swear they can still smell wood. On the wind, thick with the unmistakable scent of barbecue, and something else. Something darker. The pet shop that wasn't there. It started on a drizzly Thursday afternoon. Mallory had just moved to a new city, trying to start fresh after a breakup and a bad year. She was lonely, but hesitant to meet new people, so she decided to get a pet. Nothing too big, a hamster maybe, or a bird, something small and easy to care for. She Googled nearby pet stores and found one just a few blocks from her apartment. Pet Haven, since 1974. The reviews were mixed, but she didn't care. It was close, and she needed the company of something alive, something warm. She grabbed her umbrella and headed out. The shop was tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered antique store. Its faded sign swayed slightly in the wind, and the windows were grimy, making it hard to see inside. Mallory hesitated. The place looked off, but she shrugged it off. Not every store could look like a chain. Sometimes the best spots were the ones that didn't try too hard. She pushed open the door, and a little bell jingled weakly. Inside, the air was heavy, smelling faintly of cedar and something sour. The lights buzzed faintly, casting a dim yellow glow over rows of cages and tanks. The shop was quiet, eerily so. No cheerful chirping birds, no rustling of small animals. Just silence. Behind the counter stood an older man with wiry gray hair and a distant look in his eyes. His hands were large and calloused, and he wore an apron that looked older than the store itself. "Welcome," he said, his voice flat and tired. "Looking for something specific?" I was thinking maybe a hamster or a bird," Mallory said, trying to sound cheerful despite the unease creeping up her spine. The man nodded slowly. "Hamsters are in the back. Birds are by the window. Take your time." Mallory wandered deeper into the shop. The cages were filled, but the animals were strangely quiet. The hamsters sat still, their tiny black eyes staring at her, without blinking. The birds perched motionless, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Even the fish in the tanks seemed off, their movements slow and jerky, like they were struggling against invisible currents. She shook off the discomfort and focused on the hamsters. One caught her eye, a tiny golden one with a patch of white on its face. It was the only one moving, scurrying in a little circle, as if trying to get her attention. "This one's cute," she said aloud, turning toward the counter. The man was there, though she hadn't heard him approach. He was standing too close, his eyes fixed on her with unsettling intensity. "Good choice," he said. "That one's special." Mallory forced a smile. "Great. I'll take it." He nodded and reached into the cage without hesitation. The hamster didn't flinch as he scooped it up, placing it into a small cardboard box. As he handed it to her, his fingers brushed hers, and she felt how cold his skin was. Unnaturally cold. "That'll be $25, he said, his tone final. She paid quickly, eager to leave. But as she turned to go, the man spoke again. "Take care of it. It's important." Mallory hurried home, the unease lingering even as she set up the hamster's cage. She named him Nibbles and tried to push the strange experience out of her mind. For the first few days, everything seemed fine. Nibbles was energetic and curious, running on his wheel and nibbling on seeds. But then things started to change. The first sign was the noise. At night, Mallory would hear scratching, not just from the cage, but from the walls. It sounded like something large was moving inside, its claws scraping against the plaster. She assumed it was rats and told herself she'd call an exterminator. Then she noticed the smell. It wasn't the typical small animal odor. It was sharp and metallic, like blood. No matter how much she cleaned Nibbles' cage, it wouldn't go away. The final straw came a week later. Mallory woke up in the middle of the night to find Nibbles staring at her. He was perched on his hind legs, his tiny paws pressed against the glass, his black eyes glinting in the moonlight. It wasn't just the way he was looking at her. It was where he was looking. Her closet. Mallory's heart pounded as she sat up in bed, staring at the darkened corner of the room. The scratching started again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the closet. She grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the door. Her hands shook as she reached for the handle. She flung it open, shining the beam of light inside. It was empty, just clothes and shoes. But as she turned away, something caught her eye. A small cardboard box, identical to the one the man at the shop had given her. She hadn't put it there. Inside the box was a note. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, like it had been written in a hurry. It read, "It watches. Do not look away." Mallory dropped the note and backed away, her breathing shallow. She turned toward Nibbles' cage, but it was empty. The hamster was gone. The scratching grew louder, now coming from all around the room. The lights flickered, and the air grew colder. Mallory spun in circles, her flashlight darting around the room, but she couldn't see anything. And then she heard it, a low, guttural whisper. "Why did you bring it here?" The next morning, Mallory packed her things and left the apartment. She didn't bother trying to take Nibbles or anything else with her. She just drove, putting as much distance between herself and that place as possible. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of her. She decided to go back to the pet shop, not to buy anything, but to demand answers. But when she reached the address, the shop wasn't there. The laundromat and antique store were still standing, but the space between them was empty, a vacant lot overgrown with weeds. There was no record of Pet Haven ever existing. Mallory tried to move on with her life, but she could never shake the feeling that she was being watched. Some nights, she still hears the scratching, and sometimes, in the dark corners of her new apartment, she swears she sees two tiny black eyes glinting in the shadows. She's never kept another pet,